This is standard 6.3. This unit we're going to start looking at the Great Depression. As we look at the Great Depression, we need to know the causes and consequences of the Great Depression. We'll talk about some of those causes, which were the disparities in income and wealth distribution, meaning the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. We'll talk about the collapse of the farm economy, kind of like what we talked about before, and how an event like the Dust Bowl really had a huge effect on farmers. We'll talk about limited government regulation, which kind of led to the Great Depression, taxes, investment, and the stock market speculation, and how the policies of the government and the Federal Reserve had a huge effect on the Depression and kind of caused the Great Depression. So as we start, the economic policies in the 1920s reflected the traditional understanding of the government's limited role in the economy. It's kind of what we talked about before, the idea of laissez-faire, hands off the economy. And so before, basically, the government supported big business, didn't really protect the interests of farmers or workers, protected the bigger businesses. The Great Depression is going to call this role into question, and people are going to start to demand that the government take action and help everyday people, not just the big business owners. The basic underlying economic problems in the 1920s were overproduction and declining demand. So what both of those things do is leads to lower prices. And so as prices got lower, people could buy less, which is then going to lead to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was not caused by the stock market crash. The crash was when people realized the problems, and it really signaled the start of the Depression. So never say that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. Looking back at the 1920s seemed prosperous. There was high employment, low inflation, industrial production was up, per capita income was up. However, there were major problems that most people did not notice. One of those huge problems was the disparity in income. That meant that the rich kept getting richer and the poor kept getting poorer, and the gap between the rich and the poor grew. Wages tended to fall or stagnate, meaning it didn't grow. And so as there's more and more products out there, people aren't making nearly as much to buy new things. And so since wages are not increasing, workers can't afford to buy products. And one way they bought products, even when they couldn't afford it, was through installment spending. And they're going to reach their limit, and they're going to stop spending. And whenever people stop spending, that's when the economy starts collapsing. In addition to the problems in the industry, the farm economy also collapsed. We talked about this before. Farmers had done very well during World War I. After the war, though, farmers faced international competition and depressed prices from overproduction, which meant farmers had a hard time paying debts and taxes in the 1920s. That was very similar to the 1890s, and a lot of times farmers ended up defaulting on their loans. And you see here's a good graph of farm prices and how farm prices continued to drop and drop and drop in the 1900s. As bad as the economy was, the Republican administrators in the 1920s, they ended up making the situation worse. They abandoned a lot of the progressive policies of Theodore Roosevelt. They stopped regulating businesses. There's a return to laissez-faire, which meant that corporations became increasingly powerful. Since there was limited government regulation, businesses did not really protect consumers and laborers. The business owners were making more money, but the average everyday person wasn't making more money. And that can be a problem, because if the average person isn't making more money, then they're not spending more money, and that hurts the economy. It doesn't mean that the government was not involved in the economy, and they still had tariffs and subsidies and land grants, but most of those helped businesses as opposed to workers. Another thing that happened was they raised the tariff. And as they raised the tariff, other countries raised the tariff. And so as they do that, other countries do that, and it starts a trade war where us and other countries are basically not going to really trade of each other, and it's difficult to sell our goods to foreign markets. They end up cutting income taxes for the wealthy. The idea of that is that you cut income taxes for the wealthy, and that's going to help stimulate the economy because the rich are going to have more money to spend. They also expected that the wealthy would put their tax savings into new factories, but really what these business owners are going to do, instead of spreading their wealth down to the lower classes, they just kind of put their money into the stock market so they can make more money. And so investment in the stock market drove up speculation in businesses, and the problem, they couldn't sustain that profitability. And so businesses end up cutting back production, and so they have like these huge surpluses, and these companies began to invest their money in the stock market in speculation instead of production. Stock market speculation was really fueled by this get-rich-quick mentality, and it led to a lot of inflated stock values, which the values weren't really worth what they were supposed to be worth. and that's going to lead to a stock market crash. So the idea was you buy a stock for $10 and you expect to gain in value. It goes up to $20 and then you end up making money, and that's a good gamble. However, what happens when the value starts going down? When it starts going down, you start losing money. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what was happening at the time was people were buying on margin. What that meant was they were borrowing money to buy stocks. And it's okay as long as stocks go up and up and up. But remember, the stocks are overvalued. The paper value was too high, and if they had to sell, they would never have received the price that they originally bought it for. Well, it starts off where there's an unusually large number of sell orders in October 1929. And so all these people were trying to sell, and it led to a panic. And so everybody's trying to sell, everybody's trying to get out, everybody's trying to sell all their stocks. Problem is nobody's buying. Well, what happens when nobody is buying is that the prices go down. And so for several days, prominent bankers helped to prop up the market. But the problem is public confidence is shattered, and no one's really willing to invest. And confidence is everything when you're talking about the stock market. So on October 29, 1929, which is referred to as Black Tuesday, the market experienced the greatest crash in history. And remember, it's not the beginning of the Great Depression, but it does symbolize the end of the false prosperity of the 1920s. People can no longer pretend that everything is okay. And this shows you an example of the chart where prices are going up and up and up, and then they start crashing until 1932 when the stock market reaches its low. The economy continued to spiral deeper into depression for the next several years. There were plenty of decisions that led to going further and further into a depression, some by individual companies, consumers, investors, and the policies of the Federal Reserve made things worse. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913 as the nation's central bank, and it has the capacity to regulate money supply. They do that by making loans to banks, which then make loans to businesses, which then hire workers and who buy products. So the Fed is a very important piece of our economy, even to this day. It's a simple-looking process, but if something goes wrong, there are catastrophic consequences. So here's how the Fed led to stock market speculation and led to the Great Depression. In the 1920s, they pursued easy credit policies. They charged banks low interest rates, and as they charged low interest rates, banks were then able to charge lower interest rate to consumers, and so a lot of people are buying. And as more and more people are buying, then it's leading to an inflated economy. And they're not necessarily concerned of getting their money back since the stock market was seen as a sure thing, and they can make a huge profit. So really loaning money for people to invest instead of loaning to people to make things and thus grow the economy. By the late 1920s, the Fed began to get nervous about the stock market speculation. They started to do a tight money strategy, which meant they started charging a higher interest rate. And then after the crash, they tightened their supply even more. This is the opposite of what they should have done. They should have tightened the money supply when the economy was good to prevent inflation, and then set lower interest rates after the economy collapsed. But they did the opposite way. And if they would have done it the other way, the Depression may not have been as intense or as long-lasting. And that's one of the good things about the Depression for us, looking back on, is we learn from our mistake. And today, the United States or the Federal Reserve today did the opposite of that when the economy collapsed. And that's why our recession didn't turn into a huge depression. In past depressions, the government just waited it out and let the marketplace find its equilibrium. They didn't do anything. Hoover did break that precedent. Even though people think Hoover didn't really do much as president, he did do something which was more than any other president in the past had done. He asked companies to voluntarily maintain wages and hours, and that sounds easy, but it's really not. As there's lower consumer demand, no business is going to want to willingly lose money, so companies are going to lay off workers and cut hours. He also advocated the American value of rugged individualism and urged confidence, and kept saying that prosperity is just around the corner. And the problem with that is when prosperity is not just around the corner, and when things don't get better, then he's going to look pretty bad for it. The Great Depression was also devastating for reasons beyond the economy. It had a devastating impact on the lives of many people. It was the worst economic disaster to ever hit the United States. There are some pretty bad statistics here. There was a 25% unemployment rate. That means 1 out of every 4 Americans. And if you were an African American, it was a 49% unemployment rate, which was basically 1 out of every 2 African Americans was unemployed. There was no unemployment insurance like there is today. So if you were out of work, you were just out of luck. People couldn't pay their rents and mortgages, so they lost their homes, and they started wandering from town to town looking for work. And so some of these homeless villages became known as Hoovervilles. There's an example of a picture on this slide of a Hooverville at the time. Wages and hours were cut for those who kept their jobs, and so people still had less money. Because of the uncertainty, they stopped buying more than the necessities, which meant that prices fell even more because they weren't spending their money out in the economy. Here are some pictures of some examples of Hoovervilles during the Depression and average people and what they are, some of the people who were affected by the Great Depression. There were runs on the banks where people tried to withdraw their savings because they feared the bank would fail and close, and then they would lose their savings. So as people panicked and ran to the bank, then the banks did collapse because the banks ran out of money. And so people just lost their money. Today we have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to make sure our money's safe in the bank. Back then they didn't. If the bank went out of business, you just lost your money. There were also undernourished children during that time, like the child who's pictured here. Here's some famous pictures of the Depression, people standing in soup lines and bread lines trying to get food and basic necessities to live. The Depression was also devastating to families. Marriages were delayed and birth rate fell. There was divorces because men abandoned their families in some cases. Other families pulled together to help each other out. Unemployed men lost status, and women and children were forced into the workforce to find a job. And usually it was a hard, menial type job. State and private charities really couldn't alleviate all the problems. And so eventually people start looking more and more towards the federal government for help. But remember, the federal government had always had a policy of staying out of the economy and not helping during depressions. And so something's going to have to give. Another major problem of the Great Depression was just the environmental disaster that happened with the Dust Bowl. The farming community suffered a huge problem with the Dust Bowl, and there's a picture of what happened. There was a lot of overgrazing in the 1890s, and it led to a fragile environment of the Great Plains. Farmers had also plowed more of their plains and planted more wheat during World War I, which destroyed the sod that had held the soil down. When drought and winds came in the 1930s, that topsoil blew away and gave us the natural disaster which is known as the Dust Bowl. Understanding that because of the government policy of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the environment was damaged, the Dust Bowl produced a huge human tragedy for farm families, and they start looking for work other places. And so by the time we get to 1932, the American people are going to demand help from their government. And meanwhile, like Hoover had just kind of sat by and not really done much. People need something. They need the government to step up and do something and help out. And so that's why in 1932, they're going to be looking for a change. And that change is going to come through the form of the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That leads us into the New Deal in 6.4. If you haven't already, please turn in the notes guide and take the video quiz. Thank you.